The air inside the Manhattan Broadcast Theater buzzed with restless energy. It was a stage that had seen countless celebrities and political figures, yet tonight felt different. Under the glow of hundreds of stage lights, the audience settled into their plush seats, chatting excitedly as the iconic opening music of the prime hour swelled through the auditorium. The show, hosted by Michael Carrington, was known for its sharp wit and unrelenting interviews. He had built a reputation on asking the hard questions, the ones no one else dared to pose. As the camera panned across the eager crowd, Michael sat in his usual spot, a sleek black chair on the center stage, surrounded by an elegantly minimalistic set design. He adjusted his tie, his signature grin framed by the light bouncing off the glossy floors. The show had always leaned into controversy, and Michael thrived on it. Tonight, he was ready for another battle of wits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice carrying the practiced charm of someone who could command an audience effortlessly. "Tonight, we have an unexpected guest. Someone who, I'll admit, surprised even me by accepting our invitation." The murmurs among the audience grew louder, their curiosity piqued. Was it a famous actor? A political maverick? A controversial author? The possibilities felt endless. Michael let the suspense linger, leaning into the moment with a mischievous sparkle in his eyes. "She's a name you know, a figure who has inspired admiration, criticism, and endless headlines. Please welcome Melania Trump." The announcement hit the room like a wave, rippling through the audience with audible gasps and whispers. Some clapped, others exchanged bewildered glances. From behind the heavy crimson curtain, Melania emerged. She moved with a grace that was almost otherworldly, her ivory suit catching the stage lights in a way that made her seem ethereal. Every step she took was deliberate, her posture straight, her chin slightly raised, not in arrogance, but in quiet confidence. Her soft caramel hair framed a face that betrayed no emotion, though her deep, almond-shaped eyes carried a story untold. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm, her accent unmistakable yet delicate. Her words rolled out with the precision of someone who had learned to measure each syllable carefully. Michael, for all his preparation, faltered for just a moment. He masked it quickly with his trademark smirk. "Mrs. Trump," he said, standing briefly to shake her hand, "I'll admit, I wasn't sure you'd say yes to this." Melania tilted her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. "Life is full of surprises," she replied, her tone measured but firm. The audience chuckled, though the tension in the room remained palpable. As Melania took her seat opposite Michael, she crossed her legs gracefully, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She exuded a calmness that contrasted starkly with the buzzing energy surrounding her. It was as if she carried her own pocket of stillness, an aura that demanded attention without asking for it. Michael leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the armrests of his chair. "So Melania," he began, his voice warm but probing, "let's start with the obvious. It's been a few years since you left the White House. How's life treating you these days?" Melania met his gaze evenly. "Life is peaceful," she said simply, her words deliberate. "I spend my days focusing on my family, my projects, and my work to help children through my initiatives." Michael nodded, but there was a glimmer in his eyes that suggested he was already calculating his next move. "And yet," he said, his tone shifting ever so slightly, "many would say the spotlight has never truly left you. Does that ever bother you?" Melania paused, her gaze momentarily drifting to a distant point just beyond the camera. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet intensity. "The spotlight is not something I seek," she said, "but I have learned to live with it. It is part of the life I chose." There was something in her tone, a mix of resignation and resolve, that silenced the room. Even Michael seemed caught off guard by the depth of her words. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the gravity she brought to the conversation. "Well," he said after a brief pause, "you've certainly had a unique journey. But let's talk about the reason you're here tonight. What made you decide to sit across from me on this stage, knowing the kinds of questions I tend to ask?" Melania's faint smile returned, though her eyes remained serious. "I believe in speaking for myself," she said. "Too often, others speak for me. Tonight, I wanted to use my own voice." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The audience, previously restless, now sat in rapt attention. Michael leaned back slightly, folding his hands over his chest. "Fair enough," he said, a hint of respect creeping into his tone. "But surely you know that with this platform comes scrutiny. Are you prepared for that?" I am always prepared, Melania replied, her voice steady. Life has taught me that strength comes from within, not from the approval of others. The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, and for a moment, even Michael seemed at a loss for how to proceed. The tension in the room was thick, not with hostility, but with the weight of unspoken truths. The interview continued, but it was clear from the start that this was no ordinary guest, no ordinary conversation. As the evening unfolded, it became evident that Melania Trump was not there to defend or justify but to simply exist as herself, unapologetic, poised, and resolute. In the end, it wasn't her answers that captivated the room, but her presence. She spoke not as a political figure or a former First Lady, but as a woman who had walked through fire and emerged with her dignity intact. For the audience, many of whom had come expecting fireworks, the quiet power of her words was more impactful than any heated debate could have been. And as the first segment came to a close, Michael found himself saying something he hadn't planned. "Mrs. Trump," he said, his voice softening just slightly, "I have to admit, I didn't know what to expect tonight. But I think you've surprised us all." Melania looked at him, her expression unreadable but calm. "Sometimes," she said, "the greatest surprises come from simply being true to oneself." The audience erupted into applause, the sound carrying a note of admiration that transcended politics or controversy. In that moment, Melania Trump was not just a guest on a talk show. She was a testament to the strength of quiet resolve, the power of choosing one's own path, even when the world is watching. The applause echoed through the Manhattan Broadcast Theater as the cameras cut to a brief commercial break. Melania Trump sat still in her chair, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her face a serene mask that betrayed none of the tension she must have felt. Across from her, Michael Carrington leaned back, his practiced charm momentarily giving way to something more contemplative. As the stage crew bustled around, adjusting lights and microphones, Michael glanced at Melania, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. He was a man who thrived on control, on steering conversations in his favor. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt uncertain. She wasn't like his usual guests, those who either crumbled under pressure or fought back with theatrical vigor. No, Melania was different. Her quiet resolve unnerved him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. When the cameras flicked back on, Michael's grin returned, but it lacked its usual edge. "Welcome back to the prime hour," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew his audience was hanging on his every word. "We're here with the one and only Melania Trump, and I must say, you've already given us quite a lot to think about." Melania inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without letting them settle too deeply. Her eyes, steady and calm, rested on him as though she could see through the layers of performance he wore like armor. Michael shifted in his seat, leaning forward just enough to signal that the tone of the conversation was about to shift. "Let's dive a little deeper," he began, his voice soft but probing. "During your time in the White House, you were often criticized for remaining silent on some of the most pressing issues of our time. Looking back, do you feel that silence was a mistake?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The audience leaned forward in their seats, the anticipation palpable. Melania's gaze didn't waver. She let the silence stretch, her poise unbroken, before she finally spoke. "I do not see silence as a mistake," she said, her voice calm but firm. "In a world where everyone feels the need to speak, often without thinking, I chose to act. My focus has always been on what I can do, not on what others expect me to say." Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water, their ripples spreading through the room. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no attempt to justify herself, only a quiet confidence that left little room for argument. Michael nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's an interesting perspective," he said after a moment. "But surely, there were times when speaking out could have made a difference. Times when your voice, as First Lady, could have carried weight." Melania tilted her head slightly, considering his words. When she answered, her voice carried a note of quiet conviction. "There is a difference between speaking to be heard and speaking to create change," she said. "I chose to focus on the latter. Words without action are empty." The audience murmured in response, a low hum of approval mixed with skepticism. Michael, ever the provocateur, seized the moment. "But don't you think there were moments, critical moments, when silence might have been seen as complicity?" Melania's eyes narrowed, just slightly. For the first time, a flicker of something sharper crossed her face. Not anger, but a kind of steely determination. "Complicity," she repeated, her accent giving the word a weight that made it feel almost accusatory. "No, Mr. Carrington. Complicity is standing by and doing nothing. I have always acted where I believed I could make a difference." Her words were measured, deliberate, as if she were carving them into stone. The room fell silent, the weight of her response settling over the audience like a heavy blanket. Even Michael, seasoned as he was, seemed momentarily taken aback. He recovered quickly, leaning forward in his chair with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fair enough," he said. "But let's not ignore the elephant in the room. Your husband, Donald Trump, was, and still is, one of the most polarizing figures in modern history. How do you reconcile your platform of kindness and unity with some of the things he said and did while in office?" A collective gasp rippled through the audience, the audacity of the question leaving them stunned. Michael's grin widened, sensing he had struck a nerve. But Melania didn't flinch. Instead, she let the question hang in the air for a moment, her gaze steady. "I do not reconcile them," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "Because they are not mine to reconcile. I cannot control what others say or do. I can only control how I respond." Her answer was simple, almost understated, but it carried a depth that silenced even the most skeptical members of the audience. Michael's smirk faltered, his confidence visibly shaken. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as he regarded her with a mix of frustration and admiration. "You make it sound so simple," he said. "But surely it's not that easy." "No," Melania agreed, her tone softening just slightly. "It is not easy. But it is necessary." For a moment, the room felt impossibly still, as though everyone was holding their breath. Melania's words had a way of cutting through the noise, stripping away the layers of pretense that so often define conversations like these. Michael, ever the showman, tried to regain control. "Well," he said, his tone lightening as he reached for his pen, "I'll give you this, you certainly know how to keep an audience on their toes." Melania allowed herself a small smile, the first real sign of warmth she had shown all evening. "Sometimes," she said, "the truth is enough." The audience erupted into applause, their reaction louder and more enthusiastic than before. For a moment, even Michael seemed at a loss for words. He glanced down at his notes, then back at Melania, his expression one of genuine curiosity. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Melania met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "Perhaps," she said, "that is the problem. Too many people expect, and too few take the time to understand." The applause swelled again, and this time, it didn't stop. As the camera panned across the audience, capturing their standing ovation, it became clear that this was no ordinary interview. It was a moment, a rare and poignant reminder of the power of quiet strength in a world that so often rewards noise. And as the lights dimmed for the next commercial break, Michael Carrington sat back in his chair, his usual bravado replaced by something far more human. He had come into this interview expecting to challenge Melania Trump. Instead, he found himself challenged in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the cameras flickered back on, Michael straightened, flashing the audience his practiced smile. "Welcome back to the prime hour," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a subtle edge. "We're here with Melania Trump, who has been nothing short of candid this evening." The audience responded with polite applause, though their anticipation was palpable. Everyone could sense the direction this was headed. Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. His smile, though still present, didn't quite reach his eyes. "Melania," he began, his tone soft but pointed, "we've spoken about your time in the White House, your philosophy of action over words. But there's something we haven't touched on yet, and it's something I think the audience, and frankly the nation, has been curious about." Melania raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, her calm gaze locking onto his. She didn't speak, didn't move, but the slight tilt of her head conveyed both curiosity and caution. Michael hesitated for the briefest of moments before pressing on. "Your marriage to Donald Trump has been the subject of endless speculation. Many have questioned how you reconcile your values, kindness, unity, with some of the more controversial aspects of his presidency." A collective gasp rippled through the audience, and even the camera crew seemed to pause. Michael's question wasn't just bold, it was incendiary. But he didn't back down, his gaze fixed on Melania as he waited for her response. For a moment, the room felt impossibly still. Melania's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a spark of something deeper, stronger. She let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the question to settle over the room before she spoke. My marriage, she said finally, her voice calm but resolute, is not a political statement. It is a partnership, a commitment, and a choice I made with my heart. Her words were simple, yet they carried a depth that silenced even the most skeptical members of the audience. Michael leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. That's a powerful statement, he said. But surely, there were times when his actions or words clashed with your own beliefs. How did you navigate that? Melania's gaze softened, though her posture remained firm. In any marriage, she began, her voice carrying a quiet strength, there are challenges. There are moments when you must decide what matters most, your pride or your commitment. For me, the choice has always been clear. I focus on what unites us, not what divides us. The audience murmured in response, a mix of admiration and skepticism. Michael's expression shifted, the gears in his mind visibly turning. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. And what about the moments when unity wasn't enough? When the world demanded a response from you as First Lady, not just as a wife? Melania tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. The world will always demand something, she said. But I have learned that it is not my job to meet those demands. My job is to stay true to myself, to my values, and to the commitments I have made. Her words landed like a quiet storm, their impact far greater than any raised voice or fiery rebuttal. The audience sat in rapt silence, their attention wholly focused on the woman who had managed to command the room without ever raising her voice. Michael tapped his pen against the armrest of his chair, his expression unreadable. You've given us a lot to think about tonight, he said after a moment. But I have to ask, do you ever regret the life you've chosen? The spotlight, the scrutiny, the endless questions. A faint smile touched Melania's lips, though her eyes remained serious. Regret, she said, is for those who cannot accept their choices. I have made my decisions with my eyes open and my heart full. I do not regret my life, because it is mine. The audience erupted into applause, their reaction louder and more unified than before. Even Michael seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He glanced down at his notes, then back at Melania, his expression one of genuine curiosity. You're not what I expected, he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Melania met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. Perhaps, she said, that is the problem. Too many people expect, and too few take the time to understand. The applause swelled again, and this time, it didn't stop. As the camera panned across the audience, capturing their standing ovation, it became clear that this was no ordinary interview. It was a moment, a rare and poignant reminder of the power of quiet strength in a world that so often rewards noise. The theater lights dimmed briefly before brightening again, signaling the final stretch of the evening. The energy in the room had shifted. What had started as polite curiosity had morphed into an electric tension. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, eyes glued to Melania Trump and Michael Carrington. Every question had felt sharper, every answer a balancing act of poise and truth. Yet, as much as Melania had maintained her composure, cracks were beginning to show, subtle hesitations, fleeting glances downward, a hand that gripped her lap a little tighter. Michael noticed. He was a seasoned interviewer, adept at spotting the smallest weaknesses, and tonight, he wasn't letting this moment pass without digging deeper. Melania, he began, leaning forward, his tone softer now, almost conspiratorial. You've spoken about your values, your commitment to action over words. But there's one question I think we all want to ask. He paused, letting the silence draw out, watching her closely. Do you ever feel isolated in the life you've chosen? Surrounded by so many opinions, so much noise, do you ever feel alone? The question seemed to catch her off guard. For the first time that evening, Melania didn't answer immediately. Her gaze dropped briefly to her lap, her hands clasped tightly together. The audience held their breath, sensing the weight of the moment. Even Michael seemed to realize he had touched a nerve. Finally, Melania looked up, her expression carefully composed, though her voice carried a faint tremor. There are moments, she admitted, when the world feels very far away. When the noise becomes too loud, and I feel disconnected. Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. The audience shifted uncomfortably, as though they had been granted a glimpse into something too private, too real. Michael seized the opportunity, his tone gentle but insistent. And in those moments, what keeps you grounded? What keeps you moving forward? Melania hesitated again, her fingers tightening around each other. She glanced briefly at Michael, then at the audience, as if searching for the right words. "My family," she said at last, her voice steadying. "And my faith. They remind me of who I am, of what truly matters." Michael nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Faith," he echoed. "That's something many Americans hold dear. But faith can be tested, especially in the kind of life you've lived. Has yours ever wavered?" The room felt impossibly still. Melania's breath seemed to catch, her chest rising and falling in a way that betrayed her struggle to maintain control. Her next words came slowly, carefully chosen. "Faith is not about never doubting," she said. "It is about finding strength in the doubt. It is about holding on, even when everything around you feels uncertain." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she paused, swallowing hard. The vulnerability in her tone was undeniable, and for the first time, the audience seemed to see her not as a political figure or a public persona, but as a woman grappling with the same fears and struggles that plagued them all. Michael, sensing her discomfort, pressed on, though his voice softened. "Melania, you've faced immense scrutiny over the years. People have questioned your silence, your choices, even your marriage. How do you reconcile the world's judgment with your own sense of self?" Her eyes darted to the side for a brief moment, her calm exterior faltering. She exhaled slowly, her hands now gripping the armrests of her chair. "It is not always easy," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "There are times when the judgment feels overwhelming, when I wonder if I have done enough, said enough. But I remind myself that I cannot live for the expectations of others. I must live for what I know to be true." The words were powerful, but her delivery revealed the struggle behind them. Her usual composure had given way to something more human, more fragile. It was clear she was no longer speaking in polished soundbites, but from a place of deep personal truth. Michael leaned back, his expression a mixture of respect and curiosity. "That's a heavy burden to carry," he said. "But let me ask you this. When you look back on your time in the White House, do you have any regrets?" The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she looked genuinely lost. The audience watched intently, their own emotions mirrored in the tension on her face. She began, her voice faltering. She paused, drawing in a shaky breath. "I regret not being able to do more. There were things I wanted to accomplish, changes I wanted to make. But sometimes, the world does not allow you the space to do what you feel is right." Her honesty was disarming, and for the first time that evening, she looked vulnerable, not as a calculated image but as a person burdened by the weight of unfulfilled dreams. Michael's voice softened further. "And now? What do you hope for, Melania?" She straightened slightly, regaining some of her composure. "I hope," she said quietly, "to continue making a difference, in whatever way I can. To focus on the small acts of kindness that often go unnoticed but can change lives." The audience erupted into applause, their reaction a mixture of admiration and empathy. Michael watched her closely, his usual bravado replaced by genuine respect. The theater was silent, the kind of silence that held weight, that demanded attention. As the cameras resumed their broadcast, Michael Carrington turned toward Melania Trump, his demeanor uncharacteristically subdued. The interview had not gone as he'd planned. He had expected rehearsed answers, evasions, and polished diplomacy. Instead, he had found moments of raw vulnerability and unexpected strength. He cleared his throat, gripping his pen as though it anchored him. "Melania," he began, his voice softer now, more measured, "you've shared a great deal with us tonight, about your faith, your challenges, your choices. But there's one final question I'd like to ask." Melania sat straighter in her chair, her posture elegant, her expression serene but resolute. There was no trace of hesitation in her gaze now, only an unshakable calm that seemed to radiate from within. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the armrests, his voice dropping into a lower, almost intimate tone. "If you could say one thing to the American people, to those who have judged you, misunderstood you, or even supported you, what would it be?" The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. The audience leaned in collectively, as though the entire room were holding its breath. Melania's gaze swept over the audience before she answered. Her voice, when it came, was steady and clear, carrying an emotional weight that seemed to resonate with every person in the room. "I would say," she began, "that we are all more than what others see. Every person in this room, every person watching at home, has faced moments of judgment, of misunderstanding. And in those moments, it is not the opinions of others that define us. It is how we choose to respond. Her words struck a chord, the raw honesty of them cutting through the polished veneer of the talk show format. The audience stirred, some nodding, others whispering softly to the person beside them. Michael's brow furrowed, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. "That's a powerful sentiment," he said finally. "But surely it's easier said than done." Melania smiled faintly, her expression softening but losing none of its strength. "Of course," she replied. "The hardest truths are always the simplest. But I have learned that true strength is not about shouting the loudest or being the most seen. True strength is quiet. It is steady. And it comes from knowing who you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise." Michael leaned back, his pen forgotten in his hand. He studied her for a long moment, his usual quick wit replaced by a quieter, more reflective energy. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect you." Melania tilted her head slightly, her faint smile returning. "People rarely do," she said. "But that is the beauty of it, isn't it? The chance to surprise, to be more than what others assume." The audience erupted into applause, their reaction louder and more prolonged than at any point during the night. Some rose to their feet, their cheers filling the theater with a palpable sense of admiration. Michael glanced around, his expression one of genuine surprise. For all his years as a host, for all the interviews he had conducted, he had rarely seen such a response. When the applause finally began to subside, Michael turned back to Melania, his demeanor softer, more personal. "Melania," he said, his voice almost reverent, "it's clear you've left an impression tonight. But I have to ask, what's next for you? What do you hope to accomplish moving forward?" Melania's eyes brightened slightly, a hint of determination sparking within them. "I hope," she said, her voice gaining a quiet intensity, "to continue my work with children, to advocate for kindness and understanding. I hope to remind people that small acts of compassion can create great change. And most of all, I hope to lead by example. To show that even in the face of judgment and adversity, it is possible to remain true to yourself." Her words were met with another wave of applause, the audience rising once more to their feet. This time, the reaction was more than admiration, it was respect. As the applause echoed through the theater, Michael glanced at the camera, his professional demeanor returning but tinged with something deeper. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but filled with genuine emotion, "Melania Trump. A woman who has reminded us all tonight of the power of grace under pressure, of quiet strength, and of staying true to oneself." The camera lingered on Melania's face for a moment, capturing her serene yet commanding expression, before panning to the standing ovation from the audience. As the show transitioned into its closing credits, Michael leaned over slightly, his voice low enough that only Melania could hear. "I underestimated you," he admitted, his tone almost apologetic. "I thought I'd corner you, maybe even break you a little. But you've done the opposite." Melania met his gaze, her faint smile unwavering. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best way to win is not to fight, but to stand firm." Michael nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Well," he said with a small chuckle, "you've certainly given me a lot to think about." As the credits rolled and the studio lights dimmed, Melania rose gracefully from her chair. She thanked Michael with a polite nod, then turned toward the backstage area, her movements unhurried, her demeanor unchanged. The theater crew watched her go, their whispers filled with awe and admiration. Outside, a crowd of reporters and photographers waited, their voices rising in a cacophony of questions. Melania paused briefly on the steps, her face calm under the flashing cameras. "I have said what needed to be said," she told them, her voice carrying over the noise. "And that is enough." With that, she stepped into her car, leaving behind a theater still buzzing with the impact of her presence. The next morning, her words and demeanor dominated headlines, sparking debates and conversations across the country. Yet, Melania herself remained silent, allowing her actions and her composure to speak louder than any follow-up statement ever could. In a world obsessed with noise, Melania Trump had proven that quiet strength was the most powerful voice of all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Melania's story, one of resilience, grace, and staying true to oneself in the face of judgment. In a world filled with noise and constant demands for attention, her quiet strength reminds us all of the power of authenticity and the courage it takes to stand firm in our values. This story isn't just about her, It's about each of us and the challenges we face when the world expects us to be something we're not. What lessons can we take into our own lives? Perhaps it's the reminder that we don't need to shout to be heard, or that true strength comes not from winning every battle, but from staying steady in the storms of life. Think about the times you've been judged or misunderstood. How did you respond? Did you let the noise define you, or did you choose to rise above? If this story moved you, we encourage you to show your support. Like this video to let us know you enjoyed it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that touch the heart and ignite thoughtful conversations. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even in the chaos, quiet strength can speak volumes. Finally, we want to hear from you. What part of Melania's story resonated most with you? How do you find strength in your own moments of challenge? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your perspective could inspire someone else. Let's continue this conversation together, building a community where stories like these not only touch lives but transform them.